Hi there, I'm Renee Schwartz, and welcome to Moonlake Productions' versions of the world's best fairy tales. This series is for listeners both young and old, and features stories from the Grimm Brothers, Hans Christian Andersen, Arabian Nights, and some of the best classic tales. From Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm, Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. Once upon a time in the middle of winter, when the snowflakes were falling like feathers on the earth, a queen sat at a window framed in black ebony and sewed. And as she sewed and gazed out on the white landscape, she pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell on the snow outside. Because the red showed up so well against the white, the queen said to herself, "Oh, what I would not give to have a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as ebony." And her wish was granted, for not long afterward a little daughter was born to her, with skin as white as snow, lips and cheeks as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. They called her Snow White, and not long after her birth the queen died. After a year, the king married again. His new wife was a beautiful woman, but so proud and overbearing that she could not stand any rival to her beauty. The new queen possessed a magic mirror, and when she stood before it gazing at her own reflection, she asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And it always replied, "Thou, queen, art the fairest of all." Then she was quite happy, for she knew the mirror always spoke the truth. But Snow White was growing prettier and prettier every day, and when she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as she could be, and fairer than even the queen herself. And one day when the queen asked her mirror the usual question, it replied, "Thou art fair, my queen, 'tis true, but Snow White is fairer far than you." Then the queen flew into the most awful passion and turned every shade of green in her jealousy. From this hour she hated poor Snow White, and every day her envy, hatred, and malice grew, for envy and jealousy are like evil weeds which spring up and choke the heart. At last she could endure Snow White's presence no longer, and calling a huntsman to her, she said, "Take the child out into the wood, and never let me see her face again. You must kill her, and bring me back her lungs and heart, so that I may know for certain she is dead." The huntsman did as he was told, and led Snow White out into the wood. But as he was in the act of drawing out his knife to slay her, she said, "Oh, dear huntsman, spare my life. I promise you that I will disappear into the forest and never return home again." Because she was so young and pretty, the huntsman had pity on her and said, "Well, run along, poor child," for he thought the wild beasts would soon find her and eat her up. And his heart felt lighter, because he hadn't had to do the deed himself. As he turned away, a young boar came running past, so he shot it and brought its lungs and heart home to the queen as proof that Snow White was really dead. And the wicked woman had them stewed in salt and ate them, thinking she had made an end of Snow White forever. Now, when the poor child found herself alone in the big wood, the very trees seemed to make strange shapes, and she felt so frightened she didn't know what to do. Over the sharp stones and through the bramble bushes she stumbled, and the wild beasts ran past her, but they did her no harm. She ran as far as her legs would carry her, and as evening drew in, she saw a little house, and stepped inside to rest. Everything was very small in the house, but very clean and neat. In the middle of the room there stood a little table, covered with a white tablecloth, and 7 little plates, and forks and spoons and knives and tumblers. Side by side against the wall there were 7 little beds, covered with immaculate white counterpanes. Snow White felt so hungry and so thirsty, she ate a bit of bread and a morsel of porridge from each plate, and drank a drop of wine out of each tumbler. Then, feeling tired and sleepy, she lay down on one of the beds, but it wasn't comfortable. Then she tried all the others in turn, but one was too long, another too short, and it was only when she tried the 7th that she found one to suit her exactly. So she lay down upon it, said her prayers like a good child, and soon fell fast asleep. When it was quite dark, the masters of the little house returned. They were 7 dwarves who worked in the mines deep down in the heart of the mountain. They lighted their 7 little candles, and as soon as their eyes were accustomed to the glare, they saw that someone had been in the room, for all was not in the same order as they had left it. The first said,
"Who has been sitting on my chair?"
The second said,
"Who has been eating my loaf?"
The third said,
"Who has been tasting my porridge?"
The fourth said,
"Who has been eating out of my plate?"
The fifth said,
"Who has been using my fork?"
The sixth said,
"Who has been cutting with my knife?"
The seventh said,
"Who has been drinking out of my tumbler?"
Then the first dwarf looked round and saw a hollow in his bed, and he asked,
"Who has been lying in my bed?"
The others came running round and cried when they saw their beds, "Somebody has laid on ours too!" But when the 7th came to his bed, he started back in amazement, for there he beheld Snow White fast asleep. Then he called the others, who turned their little candles full on the bed, and when they saw Snow White lying there, they nearly fell down with surprise. "Goodness gracious!" they cried. "What a beautiful child she is!" They were so enchanted by her beauty that they did not wake her, but let her sleep on the little bed. The 7th dwarf slept with his companions 1 hour in each bed, and in this way he managed to pass the night. In the morning Snow White woke, and when she saw the 7 little dwarfs, she felt frightened, but they were so friendly, and asked her what her name was, in such a kind way that she replied, "I am Snow White."
"Why did you come to our house?"
continued the 7 dwarfs. Then she told them how her stepmother had wished her put to death, and how the queen's huntsman had spared her life, and how she had run all day till she had come to their little house. The dwarfs, when they heard her sad story, asked her,
"Will you stay and keep house for us, cook, make the beds, do the washing, sew and knit? If you keep everything neat and clean, you shall want for nothing."
"Yes," answered Snow White,
"I will gladly do all you ask."
and so she lived happily with them. Every morning the dwarfs went into the mountain to dig for gold, and in the evening, when they returned home, Snow White always had their supper ready for them. But during the day she was left quite alone, so the good dwarfs warned her, saying,
"Beware of your stepmother. She will soon find out you are here, and whatever you do, don't let anyone into the house."
Now the queen never dreamed but that she was, once more, the most beautiful woman in the world, so, stepping before her mirror one day, she said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the mirror replied, "You are fair, my queen, 'tis true, but Snow White is fairer far than you. Snow White, who dwells with the 7 little men, is as fair as you, and as fair again." When the queen heard these words, she was nearly struck dumb with horror, for the mirror always spoke the truth. She knew now that the huntsman must have deceived her and that Snow White was still alive. She pondered day and night how she might destroy her, for her jealous heart left her no rest. At last she hit upon a plan. She stained her face and dressed herself up as an old peddler woman, so that she was quite unrecognizable. In this guise, she went over to the 7 hills, till she came to the house of the 7 dwarfs, and there she knocked at the door, calling out at the same time, "Fine wares to sell, fine wares to sell." Snow White peeped out of the window and spoke to her. "Good day, kind lady, what have you to sell?"
"Good wares, fine wares," she answered. "Laces of every shade and description."
And she held one up that was made of some gaily colored silk.
"Surely I can let the honest woman in,"
said Snow White, and she unbarred the door and bought the pretty lace.
"Good gracious, child," said the old woman, "what a figure you have! Come, I'll lace you up properly for once."
Snow White, suspecting no evil, stood before her and let her lace up her bodice. But the old woman laced her so quickly and so tightly that it took Snow White's breath away, and she fell down as though she were dead. "Now you are no longer the fairest," said the wicked old woman, and she hastened away. In the evening the 7 dwarfs came home, and what a fright they had when they saw her dear Snow White lying on the floor, as still and as motionless as a dead person. They lifted her up tenderly, and when they saw how tightly laced she was, they cut the lacing, and she began to breathe a little and gradually came back to life. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said,
"Depend on it, the old peddler woman was none other than the queen. In the future, you must be sure to let no one inside if we are not at home."
As soon as the wicked old queen reached home, she went straight to her mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the mirror answered as before, "You are fair, my queen, 'tis true, but Snow White is fairer far than you. Snow White, who dwells with the 7 little men, is as fair as you, and as fair again." When she heard this, the queen became pale as death, because she knew at once that Snow White must still be alive. "This time," she said to herself, "I will think of something that will make an end of her once and for all." And by the witchcraft, which she understood so well, she made a poisonous comb. Then she dressed herself up in the form of another old woman. So she went over the 7 hills till she reached the house of the 7 dwarfs, and knocking at the door, she called out, "Fine wares for sale." Snow White looked out of the window and said, "You must go away, for I may not let anyone in." "But surely you are not forbidden to look out?" asked the old woman, and she held up the poisonous comb for her to see. It pleased the girl so much that she opened the door. And when they had settled their bargain, the old woman said, "Come, I'll comb your hair properly." Snow White suspected no evil, but hardly had the comb touched her hair than the poison worked, and she fell down unconscious. "Now, my fine lady, you are really done for this time," said the wicked woman, and she made her way back home as fast as she could. Fortunately, it was near evening, and the 7 dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying there as if dead on the ground, they at once suspected that the wicked queen had been at work again. So they searched till they found the poisonous comb, and the moment they pulled it out of her hair, Snow White came to herself again and told them what had happened. So once more they warned her to open the door to no one. As soon as the queen was home, she went straight to her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And it replied as before, "You are fair, my queen, 'tis true, but Snow White is fairer far than you. Snow White, who dwells with the 7 little men, is as fair as you, and as fair again." When she heard these words, she literally shook with rage. "Snow White shall die!" she cried. "Yes, though it cost me my own life." Then she went to a secret chamber, which no one knew of but herself, and there she made a poisonous apple. Outwardly it looked beautiful, half white and half red. Anyone who saw it would long to eat it. When the apple was finished, she stained her face and dressed herself up as a peasant and went over the 7 hills to the house of the 7 dwarfs. She knocked at the door, but Snow White put her head out of the window and called, "I may not let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs have forbidden me to do so." "Are you afraid of being poisoned?" asked the old woman. "See, I will cut this apple in half. I'll eat the white cheek, and you can eat the red." The apple was so cunningly made that only the red cheek was poisonous. Snow White longed to eat the tempting fruit, and when she saw that the peasant woman was eating it herself, she couldn't resist the temptation any longer, and stretching out her hand, she took the poisonous half. But hardly had the first bite passed her lips than she fell down dead on the ground. The eyes of the cruel queen sparkled, and laughing aloud, she cried, "As white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as ebony. This time the dwarfs won't be able to bring you back to life." When she reached home, she asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And this time it replied, "Thou, queen, art the fairest one of all." Then her jealous heart was at rest, at least as much at rest as a jealous heart can ever be. When the little dwarves came home in the evening, they found Snow White lying on the ground, and she neither breathed nor stirred. They lifted her up and looked everywhere to see if they could find anything poisonous about. They unlaced her bodice, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but it was in vain. The child was dead and remained dead. Then they placed her on a bier, and the 7 dwarfs sat round it, weeping and sobbing for 3 whole days. At last they made up their minds to bury her, but she looked as blooming as a living being, and her cheeks were still such a lovely color that they said,
"We cannot hide her away in the dark ground."
So they had a coffin made of transparent glass, and they laid her in it, and wrote on the lid in golden letters that she was a royal princess. Then they put the coffin on the top of the mountain, and one of the dwarves always remained beside it and kept watch over it, and the very birds of the air came and bewailed Snow White's death, first an owl, then a raven, and then a little dove. Snow White lay a long time in the coffin, and she always looked the same, just as if she were fast asleep, remaining white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair as black as ebony. Now it happened one day that a prince came to the wood and passed by the dwarf's house. He saw the coffin on the hill with the beautiful Snow White inside, and when he had read the golden letters that were written there, he said to the dwarf, "Give me the coffin, you shall have whatever you ask." But the dwarf said,
"No, we wouldn't part with it for all the gold in the world."
"Well then," he replied, "give it to me only because I cannot live without Snow White. I will cherish and love her as my dearest possession." He spoke so sadly that the good dwarfs had pity on him and gave him the coffin, and the prince made his servants bear it away on their shoulders. As they were going down the hill, they stumbled over a bush and jolted the coffin so violently that the poisonous bit of apple fell out of Snow White's mouth. She opened her eyes, lifted up the lid of the coffin, and sat up alive and well. "Oh, dear me, where am I?" she cried. The prince answered joyfully, "You are with me." He told her what had happened, adding, "Snow White, I love you better than anyone in the whole wide world. Will you come with me to my father's palace and be my wife?" Snow White consented and went with him, and the marriage was celebrated with great pomp and splendor. Now, Snow White's wicked stepmother was one of the guests invited to the wedding feast. When she had dressed herself very splendidly for the occasion, she went to the mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the mirror answered, "You are fair, my queen, 'tis true, but the prince's bride is fairer far than you." When the wicked woman heard these words, she was beside herself with rage and mortification. At first she didn't want to go to the wedding, but at the same time she felt she would never be happy till she had seen the young queen. As she entered, Snow White recognized her, and nearly fainted with fear. But red-hot iron shoes had been prepared especially for the wicked old queen, and she was made to get into them and dance till she fell down dead.